Jeep owners were told to stop charging their vehicles, move them away from buildings, and park them outside because the vehicles sitting in their driveway could catch fire even while switched off. That warning alone would be enough to shake one of America's most recognizable automotive brands. But it was only one piece of a much larger collapse. The company behind Jeep, Ram, Dodge, and Chrysler had gone from making more than 18 billion euros in annual profit to reporting a staggering $26.3 billion loss. Its celebrated chief executive was gone. A factory that had anchored an Illinois community for almost 6 decades had fallen silent. Dealers were openly rebelling against management, and an electrification strategy once presented as the company's future was being dismantled almost as quickly as it had been built. These weren't 5 unrelated problems arriving at the same time. They were different consequences of the same philosophy. Stellantis had built an enormous automotive empire around scale, aggressive targets, relentless cost control, and above all, speed. For a while, that strategy looked brilliant. Then the cracks started appearing everywhere at once. To understand how a global automaker reached the point where Jeep customers were being warned not to park near their homes, you have to go back to January 2021, when Stellantis itself was created. The company came from the merger of 2 very different automotive groups. Fiat Chrysler Automobiles brought the American heavyweights, Jeep, Ram, Dodge, and Chrysler. They were famous brands with enormous recognition, especially in trucks and SUVs. But the business carried aging factories and a product strategy heavily dependent on traditional internal combustion vehicles. Across the Atlantic was PSA Group, home to Peugeot, Citroën, Opel, and Vauxhall. PSA had built a reputation for efficiency, disciplined spending, and squeezing strong margins from a highly competitive European market. At the center of that operation was Carlos Tavares, a chief executive known throughout the industry as a formidable cost cutter. Put those 2 companies together, and the theory seemed almost perfect. American scale and profitable trucks on one side, European efficiency and financial discipline on the other. 14 brands, operations spanning much of the world. Enough engineering resources, factories, purchasing power, and market reach to compete with Toyota and Volkswagen while funding an enormous push into electric vehicles. Tavares became CEO of the combined company, and early results made the merger look less like a gamble and more like a masterstroke. In 2023, Stellantis generated more than 18 billion euros in profit. Investors celebrated. Tavares was treated as one of the industry's great turnaround executives. The company was making extraordinary money while preparing a transformation through its Dare Forward 2030 strategy. Electrification would spread across the portfolio. Costs would be controlled relentlessly. Margins would remain exceptionally strong. 14 separate brands would move toward the future together. The strategy depended on moving faster than competitors, faster toward electric vehicles, faster on efficiency, faster on restructuring, and faster toward ambitious financial targets. And that speed was exactly what made the success look so impressive. It was also what made the eventual reversal so severe. By 2023, the first serious warnings were already appearing in the United States, and they weren't coming from Wall Street analysts. They were coming from the people trying to sell Stellantis vehicles. Jeep and Ram dealers began looking across their lots and seeing something deeply uncomfortable. Inventory that wasn't moving. Vehicles expected to sell quickly were sitting for months. The basic problem was price. Management had protected margins and maintained high sticker prices while continuing to push vehicles into the dealer network. Dealers were left financing inventory customers increasingly didn't want at those prices. Imagine running one of those stores. Rows of Grand Cherokees are taking up space. Interest costs keep accumulating while those vehicles sit. Customers arrive, compare prices, and realize another manufacturer may give them a better deal. They leave. The manufacturer keeps sending inventory. Eventually, the problem stops being theoretical and starts threatening the dealership itself. By late 2024, frustration had become so intense that Stellantis dealers sent Tavares a direct letter warning that management's decisions were damaging their businesses. That is an extraordinary breakdown in an industry where manufacturers depend heavily on dealer relationships, and the national sales data supported their complaints. Stellantis sold roughly 1.52 million vehicles in the United States before sales dropped about 15% in 2024 to around 1.3 million. Jeep sales declined approximately 9%. Grand Cherokee sales fell around 12%. This wasn't happening because Americans had suddenly stopped buying vehicles. The broader U.S. market remained healthy while several competitors expanded. Stellantis was losing ground inside a market that was still functioning. Investors punished the company accordingly. Stellantis shares fell approximately 43% during 2024. General Motors, by comparison, rose roughly 55%. The contrast was brutal. One Detroit automaker was being rewarded, while another was watching almost half of its market value disappear. Tavares eventually acknowledged that Stellantis had made what he called arrogant mistakes in its American business. By December, the board's patience had run out. His departure was officially described as a resignation, but reporting around the company indicated that the board had effectively decided he needed to go. The executive, once celebrated for discipline, had become associated with unrealistic targets, strained relationships with dealers, suppliers, and unions, and a management approach that had become increasingly difficult to sustain. His compensation the previous year had reached about $39.5 million, more than any other Detroit automotive CEO. Then, almost overnight, he was out. The deeper problem was bigger than one executive. Stellantis had optimized aggressively for margins and efficiency, but those gains had created pressure farther down the chain. Dealers absorbed the inventory, workers absorbed the restructuring, customers eventually absorbed the product consequences. And nowhere was the human side more visible than Belvidere, Illinois. For 58 years, the Belvidere assembly plant had been part of the community's economic foundation. Thousands had worked there during its peak years, and the plant produced the Jeep Cherokee. Jobs inside that facility supported far more than the people wearing badges at the factory gate. They supported restaurants, shops, housing, local services, and families whose connection to automotive manufacturing stretched across generations. Then Stellantis announced in December 2022 that Belvidere would be idled indefinitely. By February 2023, more than 1,350 workers had lost their jobs. A factory that had defined the local economy suddenly stopped producing vehicles. Businesses around it suffered. Demand at local food assistance organizations increased. The language used inside corporate presentations might have been restructuring, optimization, or capacity management. In Belvidere, the translation was much simpler. People lost paychecks. During the 2023 United Auto Workers strike, the union eventually secured what looked like a major victory. Stellantis committed to reviving Belvidere, investing roughly $1.5 billion to retool the assembly facility for a new mid-size truck and supporting plans that included battery production. Workers finally had a reason to believe the plant might have a future. Then timelines started slipping. Commitments appeared less certain. The UAW accused Stellantis of backing away from obligations contained in its agreement, and even threatened additional strike action over the delays. For workers, each month of uncertainty mattered. Temporary employment, repeated layoffs, and smaller rounds of job cuts kept hitting people who had already spent years waiting for clarity. And that pattern matters because it appears again throughout this story. Make the ambitious promise first. Announce the future confidently. Then discover that reality is more complicated than the plan. The consequences at Belvidere were economic. With Jeep's plug-in hybrids, they became much more personal. The Wrangler 4xe and Grand Cherokee 4xe had been among the strongest evidence that Jeep could electrify without abandoning the buyers who loved the brand for off-road capability and traditional SUV identity. The Wrangler 4xe became the best-selling plug-in hybrid in the United States. That was a major achievement. Stellantis could point to it as proof that electrification wasn't merely an environmental obligation or regulatory exercise. Customers actually wanted one. And then reports of battery fires started changing the story. In September 2024, Stellantis recalled nearly 194,000 Wrangler 4xe and Grand Cherokee 4xe vehicles after 13 fires were reported. Some incidents involved vehicles that were parked and turned off. Owners received instructions that sounded almost surreal for vehicles costing tens of thousands of dollars. Don't charge them, and park them away from buildings until repairs could be completed. Think about the practical meaning of that message. You bought a Jeep expecting to put it in your garage. The manufacturer was effectively telling you the safer place was outside, away from your house. Stellantis developed a repair and told customers the issue had been addressed. Then the problem came back. In November 2025, another recall covered more than 320,000 vehicles worldwide after 19 additional fires were reported. One injury was associated with the incidents, and some affected vehicles had already received the earlier recall remedy. Owners were again advised not to charge and to keep the vehicles outdoors. By that point, this could no longer be dismissed as a single defective batch, followed by a successful fix. It had become the third recall since 2023 involving the same battery system, with evidence that previous corrective action had not fully eliminated the danger. Then Jeep's plug-in hybrid momentum appeared to stop almost overnight. The Wrangler 4xe and Grand Cherokee 4xe disappeared from Jeep's ordering lineup. Dealers faced stop-sale restrictions, preventing affected vehicles from being sold. The Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid was also removed as Stellantis reshaped its 2026 offerings. One of the company's most visible electrification successes had gone from proof of the future to a product customers were being told not to charge. At the same time, Jeep was dealing with broader complaints from owners involving interior quality, premature rust, oil consumption, and timing chain issues across different models. A brand that had built its image around toughness couldn't afford to have customers questioning basic durability. There is a fundamental difference between marketing a vehicle as capable of going anywhere and asking its owner to leave it outside because of a fire risk. That contradiction is devastating because it attacks the promise behind the badge itself. And while the recall story damaged trust, the company's finances revealed just how much larger the strategic problem had become. In February 2026, Stellantis reported a full-year 2025 net loss of approximately $26.3 billion, the first annual loss since the company was formed and the largest in its history. $26 billion. Not a weak quarter, not a temporary decline in one region. A loss large enough to force the entire organization to reconsider assumptions that had guided billions of dollars in investment. Stellantis recorded nearly $30 billion in unusual charges, much of it connected to changes in its electrification strategy. Dare Forward 2030 had been conceived during a moment when automakers expected electric adoption to accelerate quickly. Stellantis therefore invested in platforms, factories, tooling, and product programs designed around that expectation. But customer demand, particularly in North America, didn't develop at the speed the company had planned for. The contrast inside Jeep was enormous. The fully electric Wagoneer S sold just under 11,000 units during the period referenced in the results. The gasoline-powered Grand Cherokee sold roughly 210,000. One product represented the future Stellantis had spent heavily preparing for. The other represented what customers were still purchasing in vastly larger numbers. That difference forced a remarkable reversal. Antonio Filosa, who took over as chief executive in the summer of 2025, began unwinding decisions that only a short time earlier had been central to Stellantis' strategy. Gasoline and diesel power returned to places where management had planned to move away from them. The Ram 1500 had been redesigned without a Hemi V8, a decision that alienated part of Ram's traditional customer base. For 2026, the Hemi came back. Dodge had launched its next-generation Charger with electric power at the center of its reinvention, then expanded the lineup with a turbocharged gasoline engine. Plans for an all-electric Ram 1500 were canceled. Each move delivered the same message without Stellantis needing to say it directly. The company had pushed farther and faster toward electrification than the market would support. Reversing that strategy wasn't free. Engineering plans had to change. Product programs had to be reconsidered. Factories and suppliers had already been preparing for one future and now needed another. Stellantis had spent heavily moving in one direction, then faced the cost of turning around. The disruption was especially stark at Chrysler. This is one of the names that helped define the American automotive industry, yet its U.S. lineup had effectively narrowed to a single vehicle, the Pacifica minivan. No broad sedan family, no full SUV range, one surviving nameplate carrying a century-old brand. After the massive loss, Stellantis reorganized its portfolio into tiers, and Chrysler found itself near the bottom, with Dodge as management evaluated where resources should go. Chrysler wasn't even a meaningful focus of the earnings discussion announcing the results. Soon afterward, the brand's own CEO stepped aside and management responsibility was handed to the executive already running Dodge. One person was now responsible for two historic American brands facing enormous questions about what they were supposed to become. That is the paradox of Stellantis. 14 brands were originally presented as extraordinary strength. 14 identities meant scale, coverage, technology sharing, and market diversity. But every brand also requires products, investment, factories, marketing, leadership, and a reason to exist. Scale only helps when the organization can support the complexity that comes with it. Otherwise, 14 brands aren't automatically 14 advantages. They can become 14 competing demands for money and attention. And that brings everything back to the warning Jeep owners received. The inventory crisis, Belvedere, the repeated 4xe recalls, the enormous financial write-downs, and the shrinking American brands may look unrelated when viewed individually. Together, they reveal the same organizational instinct. Stellantis kept trying to move faster than the system surrounding it could comfortably handle. Pricing strategy moved faster than dealer demand. Restructuring moved faster than communities could absorb. Electrification investment moved faster than American customers changed their buying habits. New technology moved faster than the company could guarantee that every problem had been eliminated. The mistake wasn't believing that the automotive industry was changing. It obviously was and still is. The mistake was assuming Stellantis could dictate the speed of that change. Customers get a vote. Dealers get a vote. Workers and suppliers shape what is actually possible. And when something as complex as a modern automobile is involved, engineering reality gets the final vote. There are signs that the company understands this now. Stellantis returned to profitability in the first half of 2026. Jeep and Ram helped improve the North American business, and interest in the returning Hemi V8 reportedly became strong enough to challenge available production capacity. Veloci's turnaround effort is therefore not starting from zero. Stellantis still owns some of the most recognizable brands in the global industry. Jeep remains powerful. Ram still has a deeply loyal truck audience. Dodge continues to carry enormous cultural recognition. The company has factories, engineering talent, global reach, and enough scale to recover. But recovery requires something very different from the philosophy that created the crisis. It requires listening before dictating, testing assumptions against actual demand, giving dealers products they can sell instead of inventory they have to finance, giving workers commitments that survive beyond the announcement, and giving customers confidence that when a manufacturer says a repair has solved a safety issue, the same warning won't arrive again months later. Because this story was never simply about electric vehicles, and it wasn't simply about Carlos Tavares. It was about what happens when a corporation becomes so confident in its own strategy that every obstacle starts looking like something that can be forced into alignment. For a few years, the numbers seemed to prove Stellantis right. 18 billion euros in profit can make almost any strategy look brilliant. Then sales dropped, dealers revolted, the CEO disappeared, Belvedere waited, battery recalls returned, $26 billion vanished in a year. Suddenly the same decisions looked completely different. The empire created in 2021 isn't collapsing tomorrow, but the assumption that putting 14 famous badges under one roof automatically creates an unstoppable automotive giant is gone. Stellantis now has to rebuild credibility, one product, one factory, one dealership, and one customer at a time. And for Jeep owners who were told to move their vehicles away from the house and leave them outside because the battery might ignite, corporate strategy is no longer an abstract discussion about margins or electrification targets. It is the vehicle sitting 20 feet from their front door. That may be the clearest lesson in the entire Stellantis story. Companies can move quickly. Executives can set aggressive deadlines. Investors can reward spectacular short-term results. But the automobile business is ultimately held together by trust. Trust that the factory will still be there. Trust that the dealer can stand behind the product. Trust that the brand understands what its customers actually want. And most importantly, trust that when you turn the vehicle off at night, it will still be safely sitting there in the morning. Stellantis spent years testing every part of that relationship. Now the question is whether the return of the Hemi, improving profits, and a more cautious strategy represent the beginning of a genuine turnaround or simply a temporary recovery before another crack appears. If you own a Jeep, Ram, Dodge, or Chrysler, your experience matters here. Has the company earned another chance, or did it spend too much of the trust attached to those famous names? That's the question Stellantis has to answer next.